Let's go live now to foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan, who joins me today as he does every week. Greg, great to see you. This incident between our naval divers and this Chinese Navy destroyer, the sonar pulses sent, injured at least one of our sailors. They're apparently all okay, which is the good news. Does it show how fragile the new improved relationship with Beijing is?
Yeah, Kieran, great to be with you. Look, I think this does show that. I think, frankly, the government's position on China is becoming ridiculous, just as silly as the Morrison government's position was, but in the opposite direction. I think it's completely unsustainable for Albanese not to say whether he raised the matter with Xi Jinping. But also, you've got to say, what good are all these honeyed words in Beijing if a Chinese naval vessel takes a deliberate action to cause injury, which could have potentially been very serious injury, to Australian divers clearing fishing nets from the propellers of an Australian naval ship in international waters? And then if the relationship is so fragile that the Prime Minister can't even bring himself to raise such an outrageous action by the Chinese Navy when he sees President Xi Jinping, then this government is in even more of a tangle and more of an unsustainable position regarding China than the previous government was.
But I guess the counter is, if he did raise it and was forceful, he said he left them in no uncertain terms what Australia's view was. Can he do that on the one hand and not necessarily divulge that on the other? He says he doesn't want to divulge private conversations with other world leaders.
No, I think that position is utterly ridiculous. The Albanese government is developing a very bad habit of talking out of all sides of its mouth at once and saying different things to different constituencies to please different audiences. It would be perfectly okay to say, I raised this matter with President Xi, but because our discussion was confidential, I'm not going into his reply. But the idea that an Australian Prime Minister is so terrified, so timid, so tremulous that he might cause offence to the great President of the Middle Kingdom, that he won't even tell the public that he raised a matter of the Chinese Navy inflicting personal physical injury on Australian servicemen for the first time since the Korean War. So after all the honeyed words in Beijing, he won't even raise that matter, or he won't even tell us that he raised that matter, because to do so might upset the president of China and his own, inflated sense of the dignity and protocols that surround any conversations with him. I mean, the Prime Minister's not talking to God here. He's talking to another head of government about an aggressive military action they've taken, which has injured one of our sailors. I also think the Albanese government is increasingly transparent in its dismal political management of these issues. So they didn't release information about this incident until after the Prime Minister had flown out of San Francisco, so that he didn't have to answer any questions at a press conference about it. Look, this stabilised relationship has got nothing at all to do with Australian diplomacy, nothing at all. It's China deciding that it spent a few years punishing us, and then it decided to take us out of the punishment zone. And it's then saying, and if you want to remain out of the punishment zone, you've got to behave like a proper poodle and not ever raise anything disagreeable with us. Now, if that's the price of the so-called stabilised relationship, it's not such a bargain. I tell you what, it's not such a bargain. And, the government decided not to take back control of the Port of Darwin from a Chinese-owned company. The Chinese still have one of our citizens in detention on trumped-up charges. They're still, mounting massive cyber attacks against us every day. So what has this stabilised relationship got for us except for a few photo ops for the Prime Minister? And I don't think they're worth abandoning our ability to speak up on behalf of our own servicemen when they are put in harm's way by the aggressive actions of a foreign military power.
The new Argentine president, I've just been reading up on him and his plans after you suggested that we talk about this today, and it is quite extraordinary. a win for this far-right figure. What does it mean?
Well, it's absolutely fascinating, Kieran. So Argentina is very different from most Western nations. You know, it's got 140% inflation and 40% of its population living in poverty. But I do think you can link it to trends in the West. What has happened here is the Argentine electorate has said that politics as usual is no good anymore. It's just not working. Centre-left and centre-right. And they've got the same problems as Western governments have, but they've got them in a much more advanced degree. Massive government deficit, inability to run coherent economic policy, tax policy out of control, people not paying their taxes and so on. And so electorates which are absolutely fed up with centre-right and centre-left look for alternatives on the far right or the far left. I wouldn't quite necessarily describe this guy as far right. He's not a kind of a Nazi or authoritarian or something. He's a new breed. He's a libertarian. So he wants radical economic change. He wants a big cut to the size of the Argentine state. He wants to abolish the local currency and dollarise the economy so that it has to live genuinely within its means. I mean, a dollarised economy, making the US dollar the official currency of Argentina, is very tough medicine for Argentina, but it does force you to live really within your means. So I think it's a fascinating development, and he's going to have a lot of trouble governing because he doesn't have parliamentary majority or anything like that. You might get a lot of conflict in Argentina, but the election of Trump, the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Brexit vote, these are all signs of electorates saying we're fed up with politics as usual, and the alternatives they choose can be quite radical.
And Bolsonaro, you mentioned Trump, you mentioned they both welcome the result in Buenos Aires. So very interesting developments there. Greg, thanks. Appreciate your insights as always. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Kieran.